Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this morning. We are going to begin with chapter 5. It's where we left off. We have been on a break since Gimel Tammuz. Now tomorrow's already Gimel Elul. It's been a month, and it's been almost 2 months. So we're very excited to be back. We're starting with chapter 5, and the subject matter for today's class is based on the following teachings. We say every morning in davening that there are mitzvahs whose reward is immeasurable. There are mitzvahs whose reward you receive a small token. Or you could say the language of the Mishnah is you receive the interest for the mitzvah in this world, but the actual reward, the actual payment, is reserved for the world to come. And there's a long list of mitzvahs that are really, really precious, really, really special. And then the Mishnah concludes with the following statement: the Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, keneged kulam, is equal to them all. Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, is equal to all the mitzvahs. The focus of this chapter is to explain why is it that Talmud Torah is in fact equal to all mitzvahs. If we look back to the end of chapter 4, we will find a teaching that through mitzvahs we are able to attach ourselves to God. The soul, as we learned, is a divine piece of Hashem from on high. That's chapter 2. And the soul's inner workings is divided into two groups: intellectual powers and emotional powers, and that's chapter 3. Those powers are clothed in 3 garments: thought, speech, and action. And it's through dressing those garments, through putting on the garments of the godly soul, which are expressly and specifically Torah thoughts and words of prayer, and feelings of love and fear, reverence and awe, and most importantly, actions of mitzvahs, we actually connect our souls to Hashem himself, because the mitzvahs are a undiluted expression of Hashem himself. Hashem is in the mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah with your hand, you are touching Hashem himself. You are connected to Hashem himself. You are wearing godliness, literally. And the Alter Rebbe throws in a quote from Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, where Elijah the prophet says, as is recorded in the introduction to the Zohar, he says, no thought can grasp God at all. But through a mitzvah, that's how you can touch the divine. That's how you can hold the divine in your hands. So the question that we will deal with in this chapter, which could be understood as a parenthetical note, a little bit of a digression, because if you're following the order of the chapters, it goes chapter 1, introduces the whole subject. There are 2 souls. Chapter 2, the nature of the divine soul's essence. Chapter 3, the inner workings of the divine soul. Chapter 4, the modes of expression of the divine soul. Chapter 6, let's talk about the animal soul, its inner workings, and that will go on chapters 7, 8, 9. Chapter 5, after having explained that through mitzvahs you can attach yourself to God, chapter 5 says, but there's a special attachment that can be achieved through Torah study. And that is what we will focus on in this chapter. I will share with you a beautiful summary of our friend Rabbi Chaim Miller.
What's the essential message of chapter 5 of the Tanya? Chapter 5 is really kind of footnote to chapter 4. just fleshing out of some details which were unaddressed in chapter 4. Chapter 4, we learned a great revelation that our deepest connection to God is through the Torah. And even though deep down inside our souls, who knows what's lurking there, as long as we behave in action, in speech, and in even controlling our thoughts by thinking appropriate thoughts, as long as we're doing that, we're very deeply connected to God. Chapter 5 picks up on that theme. And it really addresses the question, well, in Torah observance, there's really two categories. There's mitzvahs, which is the physical rituals and commandments, observing them. And then there is Torah study, when we get the sacred text of this Torah and we study it with our minds and say, repeat the words with our mouths. What is the more deeper connection with God of those two? That is what chapter 5 addresses. And chapter 5 states emphatically it's the latter. It's Torah study which provides a deeper merging experience with God. In fact, there's no merging experience like it. Because what's really happening with mitzvah observance, when you follow a command, you vacate your ego and you replace your will with God's will. Whatever you would like to have done at that moment, you decide, no, I'm going to observe what the Torah says, and therefore you cause the infinite light of God to flush into your garments, but kind of you had to get out of the way for that to happen. You removed your will to do God's will. So even though God's light's present in a very, very powerful way, you wouldn't exactly call that the perfect merging experience between you and God. It's not unio mystica in the fullest sense. It is kind of vacating the ego to let God in. And that's why Torah study is different. Torah study requires the ego. You can't sit in front of a text and say, oh, whatever this means, let that just enter my mind. No, you have to use your cognitive apparatus. You have to use your analytical skills. And for that, you need your identity, your ego, your faculties. And nevertheless, at the same time that you are fully ego engaged, you flood your being with the infinite divine light of the Torah. And that's the distinction, says chapter 5, between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah's mitzvahs, observing the commandments, is a merging experience, but it's not a perfect merging experience because your ego had to get out of the way. Torah is a yichud nifla, a phenomenal merging experience where your being is seamlessly and utterly merged with the highest revelation available to man, God's will as it is in the Torah.
Okay, on that note, let's begin. The quote from the Eliyahu Hanavi, no thought can grasp him at all. Says the Alter Rebbe, to begin chapter 5, we have to understand the use of the term grasp. Because grasping, I can grasp a cup, I can grasp a ball. Grasping doesn't seem naturally related to intellect, to logic, to mind. It seems more appropriate for physical objects. Why then, what's the lesson, what's the meaning in the term, or in the use of the term, grasping? Why must one strive, or why would one strive to grasp? How could one grasp godliness or Hashem himself? No mind can grasp Hashem. At first glance, it would be like saying no mind can grasp the scent of fresh coffee. Yeah, because minds are not made for grasping. Minds are not made for grasping scent. Minds are not made for grasping something that is not tangible. How then obviously when Eliyahu Hanavi says, you Hashem have made all these things, but none of these things are what you are made of, and therefore no mind can grasp you at all. That makes sense. But again, why the language grasping? It would make, if we're talking about the mind, it would make better sense to say, no thought can understand you at all. No thought can fathom you at all. Grasping must have some deeper meaning in it. that we're not aware of. That's what the Alter Rebbe will take us through in this chapter, chapter 5. Let's read in the words of the Alter Rebbe. Let's explain further and fully, elucidate. The expression tfisa, apprehension, grasping, in the words of Eliyahu Hanavi, where he says, no thought can grasp you at all. Hine, we can understand it this way. Kol seichel, any time a person's mind, kishemaskil umasig, when he conceives of something and then grasps it fully, besichla, in his mind, eze muskal, any subject matter, the intellect, his intellectual faculties, grab hold of the idea and surround it intellectually, the way my father describes it, borrowing from all the Tanya teachers on YouTube, I tell you. The way my father describes it is, when you understand, when you have grasped the beginning and the end of a subject, you know it end to end, your mind has got it enwrapped, your mind has got it wrapped up. That is the phenomena of the mind enwrapping the idea, embracing the idea, taking the idea in. Veha muskal nitfasu mukafam ulubash b'secha secha she'esigoi. And the subject matter in turn is grasped and surrounded and clothed in the intellect, she'esigoi v'hiskiloi, that he understood it and that he conceived. Okay, that makes sense. It's two ways. When I'm holding an object in my hand, I hold a pen in my hand is embracing the pen, and the pen is embraced in my hand. Now here's the novelty. Here is the newness. The gam haseichel melubash b'muskal b'shoah shemasigei v'teifsei v'sichlei. Not only is the intellect like a pen embraced by my hand, and my hand is embracing the pen, but the mind is also embraced by the thing it is embracing, by the thing it is grasping. That is a phenomenon that doesn't exist in the physical world. We're not talking about an embrace where two people each one is wrapping their arms around the other, because that's not a full embrace. That's a very external one. The arms of each person is wrapping around the body of the other person. That's not a full embrace. That's not fully enveloping. Each one is fully enveloping the other. Think about this. Try to imagine in a physical sense where one thing completely envelops and surrounds and clothes another thing, object B, and object B simultaneously is fully enveloping and clothing and embracing object A. It's something that doesn't exist in the physical world. But that's what happens when a person grasps something in their minds. So here we already see the value of the language of grasping. We're talking about an embrace. We're talking about enveloping another object, object A. Your mind envelops object B, the concept. And soon we'll see the value of that imagery. We have a few interesting tidbits from the Rebbe's Torah and from the Alter Rebbe's earlier teachings. Like this. The Tanya here, in the beginning of the second paragraph, uses the terms when an intellect conceives and comprehends. Two things, conceives and comprehends. And a careful reading of the Tanya, a person that's reading Tanya carefully will have to ask, why the double language? Just say, when an intellect comprehends, or when an intellect conceives. The answer is, of course, as we learned in chapter 3. This is the intellectual process. Chochma and then Bina. Chochma conceives of an idea in its entirety, but without any details fleshed out. The whole idea, the light bulb goes on in your mind, and your mind has in it the whole concept. But the ideas have yet to be, the details of the idea have yet to be fleshed out. And then there is the second stage in the process, which is Bina, where you could call it contemplation, you could call it analysis. Bina is the stage where every detail gets studied, every angle is examined, and you come away with a full and broad and deep and true understanding of the subject matter. That is called comprehension. Chochma is conception. You've got the whole thing in a summarized, shortened form, in germ form. And then you have the Bina, where it's analyzed and you've got every detail. What, in fact, is the difference between a person that has truly grasped and a person that has merely conceived and maybe only begun the process of grasping? For this, let's go to the Alter Rebbe's teachings that we have been learning in Shul on Shabbos morning in preparation for the month of Elul. The subject that the Alter Rebbe is discussing in that Maimer, that's from the Kutei Torah, Parshas Devarim, on the first page. The Alter Rebbe says, we wake up in the morning and we say, Moide ani lefanecha. I acknowledge you, Hashem. It also means I offer thanks before you, Hashem. It also means moide from the term hoida, which means I acquiesce, I give in, I admit, I confess. And the question that the Alter Rebbe asks is, if I'm acknowledging the existence of my Creator, that's clear. All right, no problem. If I am giving thanks to my Creator as I wake up in the morning, I understand that as well. The question Alter Rebbe is left with is, Umahu hoida. What's this acquiescence? What is this admission? What is this giving in that the word moide ani lefanecha might mean? And he explains the question. Ki moidim chachamim leRabbi Meir. When it says in the Talmud that chachamim, the sages, acquiesce, they give in to Rabbi Meir, why would they have to do that? Lefi shemechulakim tchila. It's because previously they had debated. Chachamim had their opinion, Rabbi Meir had his opinion, and moidim chachamim Rabbi Meir. The sages will give in, acquiesce, admit that Rabbi Meir's opinion is the correct one, and they will leave their opinion behind. Well, how can we say that about Hashem? That we have an opinion and you have an opinion, and we admit that your opinion is correct. How do we have? What's the debate? Where exactly do we fight with Hashem? Where do our opinions diverge? That we should have an argument, that we should have to acquiesce and give in and acknowledge and confess and admit that Hashem's opinion is correct and ours is wrong. The Alter Rebbe explains, Ach, ki onu. Truth is, we, Sheichne Mata, who dwell in the lowest places, Oimerim, we say, Shehabriya hu yesh me'ayin, that the creation is something out of nothing. We call the creation something, and we call the source from which the creation comes nothing. Sheshamayim va'aretz u'shmei hashamayim, that the heavens and the earth and space, outer space, davar hayesh hanira le'einenu, is the thing that exists as our eyes can see. U'masha lamayla hu ayin. Whatever is higher than that is nothing. Nothing. But from Hashem's perspective, the exact opposite is true. Min from what our eyes can see. Ki, why is that? Kulo kameke lo mamish choshev. Everything that was created is before Hashem as not, as nothing. The chol mashelamatahu yeser. The lower, the more far down, the farther down on the creation chain, the created object is yeser kelahu cha'ayim. It's more as nothing and as not. And all the while Hashem is very well aware that his existence is the true existence. So here we have a debate. Created beings say the creation is real, and the creator, we don't know him, we don't see him. We refer to the creator as nothing. While the creator, he knows that he is the real existence, the true existence, the truth of all existence, and everything that comes from him is as nothing. We have a debate. In other words, some Hasidim say the work of Hasidus is to transform our perspective. Our inborn perspective is the world is obvious and spirituality is novel. And Hasidus's job is to change the perception so that godliness should be obvious and the creation should appear novel. That's the debate. To take a human being from his inborn human perspective and help him to adopt the creator's perspective. Godliness is true and the creation is temporary, novel, new. See, we're here in the middle. And it's about this that we say, we confess, we admit. We confess, we admit that the truth is as Hashem sees it. Hashem's perspective is the true one. That's why we wake up in the morning and we say, we confess, we admit. Of course, the way we say that in the very first moments of our morning is very different than the way we mean it later in davening after we have contemplated and meditated and spent time understanding and grasping the greatness of Hashem and his involvement in creation. When we say at the end of the Amidah, Moedim Anachnu, we're making the same confession, but it's a much richer one. It's filled with much more awareness and appreciation. But that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that we have a opinion. We understand that Hashem has a different opinion, and we confess, we admit that Hashem's opinion is correct. And here is the point. This is the link. The next and final paragraph is the reason why we brought this mimer into this chapter of Tanya. Ach im kol zeh, nevertheless, hahido hu meirochek. Simply admitting, simply acquiescing, simply giving in and saying, your opinion is correct and my opinion is wrong, hu meirochek. That is an act that is done from afar, meaning, dehainu shebe'atzmai einay eitzel v'samach lazeh shemoida. That the person who is giving in, the person who is acquiescing, the person who is admitting your opinion is correct, my opinion is wrong, has not moved any closer to the opinion that he's admitting to, has not moved any farther away from the opinion that he held previously. He still holds what he's held, and the other guy holds what he holds, and just you give in. You say, I don't see it your way, but obviously you are correct. I give in, I admit, I acquiesce. Maybe one day I'll see it the way you do. A human being says to Hashem, I don't see it the way you do. When I look around the world, I see big, beautiful world. That's real. What is spiritual to my mind seems mythical. And that's where I am. And I haven't moved, even at the same time that I know that you are correct and my perception is faulty. That's me. The result of that is when a person has really not grasped fully and completely the depth and breadth and length of the other person's teaching, the other person's idea, the other person's opinion, he's not moved. They remain very much separate from each other. As much as the mind has heard it, accepted it, and even admitted to it, you don't have a merging of the two. The idea does not become the person. The person does not become the idea. Or in other words, that way of thinking does not become this person's way of thinking. It doesn't become his perception, his perspective. And that's why, as the quote from the Maimer concludes, and therefore, ganbo apum machtarto rachmono karya. That's why it's possible for a thief, as he is about to break in and steal, which means he's about to transgress the will and the command of Hashem, he prays to God for assistance, for success. How could it be? It's such a contradiction. He obviously believes in God, he's praying to him. He obviously believes that God has the power, he's praying to him. And yet he's breaking Hashem's commandments. How can that be? The answer is, he knows about God. He knows about Hashem's wishes and will, and he knows about Hashem's power. He doesn't really know it. He doesn't know it to the point where it becomes the way he sees the world. They remain separate from each other. But if a person is successful, as the Alter Rebbe says in the language of the Tanya, when an intellect conceives and comprehends, he's gone through the whole intellectual process. Till the subject matter becomes his own idea. The Rebbe says in a Sikha that many times in the Mishnah particularly, but in general, and I believe this question was raised with regards to the second section of Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe quotes the teaching, and then he quotes a teaching in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, but the teaching predates the Baal Shem Tov by a long shot, by many, many hundreds and thousands of years. The teaching is that the words with which Hashem created the world, they remain firmly implanted in each creation, because if not, those creations would cease to exist. That means the words of Hashem with which he created, they remain permanently affixed in the creation. How could you call it a Baal Shem Tov's teaching? It comes from before. How could you call any teaching where the teacher is quoting an ancient tradition from generations earlier? How could you call it his teaching? For example, in the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, in the tractate Pirkei Avos, you have Mishnah after Mishnah after Mishnah of people sharing teachings that have been in the tradition of the Jewish people for generations. Why do they get to call it, he used to say, as if it's his teaching? So this might be the connection to the answer. The Rebbe's answer is, when it becomes so much a part of you that it's literally the beating of your heart, then you could call it your teaching. You don't have to quote it in the name of a person. When it becomes the way you think, when the world presents a challenge to you and your response is based on this teaching, that's you. That's no longer a teacher whispering in your ear. That's you. That idea has become one with you. You're expressing only yourself. You're not expressing the lessons from your teacher now anymore. You have integrated it to the point where it becomes you. It became one with you. The only way that's possible is if you really grasped the learning, the lesson in every detail till its very depth. This way of learning, if we can achieve that when it comes to a lesson from the Torah, will allow us to not physically, but practically literally grasp Hashem in our minds in a full embrace, and to simultaneously be fully embraced by Hashem. Let's see how. Derech mashal. Let's take an analogy. This is backward now again in the Tanya's language. When a person understands and comprehends fully and clearly any halacha in the Mishnah or the Gemara, his mind embraces and envelops that idea. And simultaneously, your mind is clothed in that subject at the same time. So again, this is unique to the world of thought, that your mind is enveloped in the thing that you're doing. I'm sorry, it's not really unique. When you are doing something with your hands are clothed in that activity. Your hands cannot do something else. When you are speaking certain words, your words are clothed, your mouth is clothed in those words. You cannot speak anything else. When your mind is focused on a certain subject, your mind is clothed in that subject. It cannot think of anything else. But here is the distinction that we must point out between mitzvah observance and Torah knowledge or Torah study. When a person is performing a mitzvah with his hands, his mind might be elsewhere. When a person is performing a mitzvah with his mouth, the mind might be elsewhere. When a person is fulfilling a mitzvah with his mind, the mind cannot be anywhere else. The mind is clothed in the subject matter that he is studying. And the subject matter obviously is contained within his mind. So it's a two-way embrace. Vihine, halacha zu. Now, what does this have to do with our closeness to Hashem, merging with the divine? Since this halacha, this teaching from the Torah, is the actual wisdom and the actual will of Hashem. As we've repeated already many times in the Tanya, that Torah is Hashem's wisdom, and Hu v'chachmasei echad, and Hashem, together with his wisdom, are literally one being. And we've tried many, many times and in many, many ways to describe it and to bring that down into an understandable context, shape, form, all unsuccessfully. As the Rambam says, that's something that we cannot really grasp in the human intellect. The bottom line is that because it's a teaching from the Torah, and the Torah is literally the wisdom and the will of Hashem, by way of analogy, that it arose in Hashem's mind. That's not the analogy, that's true. It arose in Hashem's will, that when Ruvain will argue such and such, derech mashal, by way of analogy, v'Shimon kach v'kach, and his friend Shimon will argue so and so, such and such. Yihi hapsak beinehem kach v'kach. The ruling between them should be such and such, whatever it is. That is the will of Hashem. That arose in the will of Hashem, not in response to any physical phenomena. This is the will of Hashem originally. It originates in the will of Hashem, and therefore, even if this kind of a case will never and has never been, it never was and it never will be that one guy will argue that particular argument and the other guy will argue that particular counter argument, and that the decision has to be that particular decision. It's never happened and it never will. Nevertheless, because the will of Hashem is not in response to any physical or worldly phenomena, it is the pure and unadulterated will of Hashem himself. It arises and originates in the will of Hashem himself. Therefore, it's valuable to study it, because that is the will and wisdom of Hashem. Mikol Makim, said in the Alter Rebbe's words, Mikol Mokim, nevertheless, still, since this is what arose in the will and in the wisdom of Hashem, that if they will argue, if this guy will argue this, and that guy will argue that, the punchline, the decision should be that, when a person knows and he has grasped in his mind this decision, as the halacha is brought down, whether it's in Mishnah or in Gemara or in the later decisors, he has reached, he has attained, he has comprehended, he has apprehended, he has grasped the wisdom and the will of Hashem himself, about which Eliyahu Hanavi said, "The leis machshavat tfisa bei v'lo b'ritzayin v'chachmasei." Hashem cannot be grasped. His will and wisdom cannot be grasped by the human intellect, ki'im, except within the context of halacha. B'hislabshus, the way that it is clothed, b'halaches ha'arukes lefanenu, in the laws, the way that they are organized and arranged for us in our sfarim, in our holy books that we can study. When a person studies these laws, the clear and final decisions of Torah, law of halacha, he is grasping with his mind and embracing and enveloping with his mind the actual will and wisdom of Hashem. And at the same time, simultaneously, Hashem's will and wisdom is embracing him and enveloping his mind at the same time. There's a word here that we didn't use earlier. Earlier we used the language of conceived and comprehended. Maskil, what was the language we used earlier? Maskil umasig. Oh, there it is, masig. Comprehending. Masig really means reaching. You're able to reach it. Oh, it's a high mountain. Can you masig the peak of the mountain? Masig means to reach something far away. But analysis, intellectual analysis, is very much like climbing a mountain. It's like pursuing the end of the idea until you can catch it and grab hold of it. When a Jew can grasp, when a Jew can apprehend and thereby comprehend, or vice versa, comprehend and thereby apprehend a halacha of Torah, he's grasping in his mind and he is enveloping in a huge and complete embrace Hashem's will and wisdom, which is one with his self, one with the self of Hashem. And at the same time, the will and wisdom of Hashem, which is the same as the self essence of Hashem, is embracing and enveloping him. Says the Alter Rebbe, "Yichud nifla she'ein yichud kamohu." This is a union that is amazing, it's wondrous, and there's nothing like it in the physical world, as we described earlier. Two physical objects embracing each other, either one is enveloping and one is enveloped, or the two are not really enveloping each other, they're just holding on to each other, next to each other. That's the best that could be in the physical world. To have two objects, object A and object B, each one embracing and fully enveloping the other, and at the same time being fully enveloped by the other, does not exist in the physical world. This is a total merging. That's something that is unimaginable in any other context. The Rebbe points out something very, very special. I believe it's based on his father's teachings, the teachings of Reb Leivik. Look over here. In the analogy, I'll highlight it for you, if you don't mind. Try anyway. Here. This law, remember, this is part of the analogy. The Alter is giving us examples of how a person might study Torah in a manner that would lead to this incredible embrace with Hashem. It says, when it arises in the mind, it rose in the will of Hashem, that when Ruvain will argue kach v'kach, which means so and so, or this and this, or this and that. Again, by way of an analogy, and Shimon will argue this and that. The decision should be this and that. Yeah, 3 times, this and that. And then, a paragraph later, the Alter Rebbe says, even if that halacha will never actually be, it will never actually happen that if one guy argues so, kach, not kach v'kach, just kach, and the other guy will argue so, again, not so and so, or this and that, just kach, yihapsak kach. So the Rebbe says, what's the secret here? The Rebbe's father paid very, very careful attention and read mystical secrets into every word of Tanya. And he says, how come in the earlier paragraph it says kach v'kach, kach v'kach, kach v'kach? So and so, so and so, so and so, or this and that, this and that, this and that. But in the very next paragraph, he changes the style of his writing so that it's just one argues so and one argues so. The decision is so. And the Rebbe explains, again, I believe it's based on the teachings of his father, the Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. What are we describing in the first paragraph? We're describing in the first paragraph a mashal, an analogy of something that arose in Hashem's mind that is expressed in halachos that are given to us to understand. The Rebbe adds, usually an analogy is something very precise. You're trying to bring out a precise point. It's very strange. An analogy should be so vague and general. This guy argues this and this guy argues that. Where are the details? You're trying to teach me something precise and specific. Give me some details. No, it's a very general thing. He argues this, he argues that. The decision is whatever. It's a strange mashal. But here is the secret, the mystical secret behind these words. You have mashal, which means analogy. Yeah, you see derech mashal. Proverb, proverbial saying, a byword, parallel, allegory, tale, fable, poem, example. Mashal, kach, and kach. The analogy, this and that. 3 things. When we're talking about Torah that originates in the will of Hashem and then is expressed into Torah on the highest level and then is translated into Torah on the lowest level so that we could understand it, you have 3 things. You have the will and wisdom of Hashem, the way that it is found in Hashem's own essence, unexpressed, undelineated, unarticulated. Then you have the way the will of Hashem is expressed as will, as desire, and as wisdom. And then you have the way it's translated into our world, the way it's translated into our halachas, the way it is in the Sfarim. But if those halachas will never come to pass, these halachas in the previous paragraph are reflecting real world phenomena. But if the halacha will never be, never was, and never will, it's not really reflecting a lowest level phenomena. So all you need is the mashal, the will of Hashem, the way it is unarticulated in his essence, and kach, one expression, the way that it is expressed in the will of Hashem on high, but it never does get translated into real life experiences so that it doesn't require the second kach. Something very, very special. Okay. About this union, in general, about the presence of Hashem's own will and wisdom in a halacha more than in anything else. All the debate in the Talmud, all the analysis that is done in the Gemara, and even the expressions of Hashem's will, the way they are in the Chumash, it's all very underdeveloped. There's a lot of secrets there. How the Hashem's will and wisdom is purely and clearly expressed in halacha more than anything. And therefore, as we've said before, the Alter Rebbe, when he would learn Torah, as many, many Jews do, when they're learning whatever the subject that they're learning, they introduce it with a Yiddishism. that's not the right word, with a Yiddish, with a introductory saying. For example, you learn Chumash, and you're going to learn Rashi's commentary on Chumash. So you say, Taicht Rashi, which means Rashi explains. Or you're going to learn Tosfos on the Gemara. You say, Frag de Tosfos, which means the Tosfos asks. And for Tosfos answers. Or you're learning Talmud. You say, Frag de Gemara, and for the Gemara, Zag de Gemara. The Gemara asks, the Gemara says, the Gemara answers. The Alter Rebbe would do all those things. The unique thing that the Alter Rebbe would do is that when the Alter Rebbe was learning Shulchan Aruch, which is pure and simple law, what you do and what you don't do, a pure and unadulterated expression of Hashem's will, the Alter Rebbe would introduce his study with the words Unva, Sevil, Ratzin, Elyon. And what does the supernal will want? I've studied Gemara, and I've studied Tosfos, and I've studied Rashi, and I've studied Chumash. But what does Hashem want? That's halacha. The spiritual inner workings of this union that happens between the soul of a Jew, the mind of a Jew, and the Torah is explained by the Alter Rebbe in a Maimer from Vayikra, page 4, column 3. HaTorah hi chachmasei yisbarich sheba atzilus. The Torah, in its first iteration, the way that it's expressed outside of the essence of Hashem, is the wisdom of Hashem on the level of Atzilus. Why the wisdom of Hashem? Because Chachma, in its humility, is the only appropriate vessel for pure and unadulterated divine light. In the wisdom of Atzilus is clothed actual infinite light from Hashem. The Lochen Nikra HaTorah Mashal HaKadmoni. That's why Torah is referred to as the analogy of the primordial, or the primordial analogy, which is, we're referencing the Torah that we have here on earth is called Mashal HaKadmoni. It's an analogy for that first iteration of wisdom, Chachma Ilah, the supernal wisdom, Shel Kelila Erein Sei Baruch. The supernal Chachma is also an analogy for that which came before it. Why? Because it contains the pure and unadulterated divine light of Hashem, Shehu Kadmona Shalom, which is the primordial thing. The light of Hashem is the most primordial thing. I don't know if primordial is the right word anymore, but it is the most first. It is the first of all. And that's why the Torah, Chochma of Yatzilus, which contains the original light of Hashem, is called Mashal HaKadmoni, the analogy for that which came first. Here, the Chochma de Atzilus, while then Chochma of Atzilus, Nislabisha beChochma de Biyah, is then clothed, lowered and clothed in the Chochmas of every creation, so that it could be, so that you could eventually have the wisdom of Hashem clothed and expressed in the halachas the way that they are found in our Sfarim. Which are discussing physical things, the Asiyah, physical action things, Peya, Terumais, Maiseres, charity, tithing, Yitzias HaShabbos, carrying from one domain to another on Shabbos, physical things. As the end expression of Hashem's spiritual supernal wisdom, and even more than supernal wisdom, Hashem's original primordial light. So when a person is studying the Torah, mavin, and he's understanding it properly, masig, and he grasps ezei halacha la'ashura, some halacha correctly, and again, la'ashura means you grasp it to the point where it becomes the very way that you think. You're not borrowing lessons from anybody. This becomes your perspective. This idea is expressed also in a story where the Frierdiker Rebbe saw his father, the Rebbe Rashab, I believe the details are correct, saw the Rebbe Rashab washing in the morning before davening differently than the way he washed in the afternoon before a meal. That in the morning the Rebbe Rashab would wash and then dry his hands completely, lift up his hands in the air like this, as the Kabbalah describes we should, explains we should, till the level of the payas, but not higher, and says the bracha, Whereas by the meal time, the Rebbe Rashab would wash his hands, and on the third pouring on the left hand, he would catch some of the water in his hands, and while his hands were still wet and there's water in his left hand, he would say the bracha al nitilas yadayim, and then pour that water from his left hand on his right and rub the two hands together, and then dry his hands. And the previous Rebbe, his son, asked the Rebbe Rashab, why do you do it this way? What's your source? And the Rebbe Rashab said, I know there is a source because I have trained myself to only act according to halacha. That means, and then later the Rebbe Rashab did in fact find the source. That means the Rebbe Rashab taught himself, not taught himself. The Rebbe Rashab studied the halacha till it became the actual way that his worldly perspective functioned, so that in every situation he could respond Toiradik, in the Torah way, without any doubt. He knew for certain this is how the Torah would require him to act in this situation. That's called knowing it la ashura, knowing it properly. When a Jew learns Torah and grasps any halacha la ashura, the correct way, the appropriate way, the way that it becomes you, then your wisdom is attached to the wisdom of Hashem in that halacha, and they become literally one from every angle and from every aspect. And so on. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let's do it again sometime.